There is a particular kind of man who manages to walk into one of the most scrutinized institutions on earth and somehow make it look effortless. Not because he is oblivious to the pressure, but because he has spent his entire life building the kind of quiet confidence that pressure tends to slide off of. Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi is that kind of man. He arrived in Princess Beatrice's life carrying a title most people did not know he had, a business empire most people had not heard of, a complicated personal history that the tabloids could not quite get their arms around, and a calm that seemed almost engineered for exactly the chaos he was walking into. The royal family he married into was, at the precise moment he entered it, navigating one of the most damaging public scandals in its modern history. He smiled, adjusted his collar, and kept building. Who he actually is beneath the polished surface, the Seville rose suits and the property developer LinkedIn profile, is a more layered and genuinely interesting story than the one the tabloids assembled in a hurry when his name first appeared next to Beatrice's in the gossip columns. It is a story about old European nobility colliding with modern ambition, about a broken engagement, and a little boy named Wolfie, about a wedding that almost nobody saw coming, and about what it actually takes to stand steady inside a family that the entire world has opinions about. A name that carries history. The first thing most people learn about Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi, after they spend a moment figuring out how to pronounce it, is that the name itself is a kind of biography. The Mapelli Mozzi family holds a hereditary title of count, granted by King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy in 1913 and passed through male descendants of the line. Italy formally abolished its royal titles in 1946 when the monarchy ended, but abolished in law and abandoned in identity are two very different things, particularly when your family has been embedded in European aristocratic culture for centuries and still owns a 15th century estate in northern Italy that began its existence as a monastery. Edoardo's ancestry, according to family records and genealogical documentation, traces back through Italian nobility to figures from the medieval period, including connections to the royal house of Sicily. For most families, a lineage stretching back to the Middle Ages would be the headline. For the Mapelli Mozzis, it is essentially the context. The Villa Mapelli Mozzi in Lombardy, the ancestral estate, still stands and still functions, operating today as a luxury hospitality venue set across grounds that have been in the family's possession for generations. What makes Edoardo genuinely unusual within this context is that he is not a man who retreated into inherited prestige. He was educated at the Dragon School in Oxford, one of England's most competitive preparatory institutions, then at Radley College, and later completed a master's degree in politics at the University of Edinburgh. He emerged from that educational formation not as a gentleman of leisure, but as someone with a specific, concrete ambition. At 23 years old, with a degree and a network and an eye for spatial design that would later be traced to his dyslexia, a condition that often reshapes how people perceive and process visual information, he founded a property development and interior design company called Bonda, building an empire in brick and glass. Bonda Property, launched in 2007, was built around a deceptively simple proposition: identify areas of London with unrealized potential, develop high-specification residential properties with an emphasis on design quality, and sell them to buyers at the upper end of the market. In practice, what Edoardo built was something considerably more ambitious than that description suggests. By the time his relationship with Princess Beatrice became public knowledge, Bonda had overseen a development portfolio valued at over $800 million. That is not a boutique operation. That is a significant enterprise by any measure, operating in one of the world's most competitive and expensive property markets. Bonda became known for a distinctive aesthetic vocabulary: clean lines, meticulous material choices, interiors that looked as though they had been assembled by someone who had both studied architecture seriously and spent a great deal of time in the world's best hotels. Edoardo's Instagram presence, which functions as an ongoing portfolio of completed and aspirational projects, reflects a man genuinely engaged with the visual dimensions of his work rather than someone performing enthusiasm for a product he regards as merely financial. He was also notably willing to express views outside the property sector. In 2016, he wrote publicly about London's development priorities, specifically making the case for increased central London redevelopment and directing pointed criticism at political figures he believed were obstructing it. He commented on the American presidential election that same year with opinions that were hardly hidden. This is not the behavior of someone who absorbed the standard lesson that people in proximity to the British royal family should project a kind of studied neutrality about everything. It is the behavior of someone who had not yet fully reckoned with the implications of the life he was about to enter. Not everything Bonda touched succeeded. A planned luxury beachfront development on Australia's Gold Coast, a project called Masthead Ocean Club that was announced with a kind of glossy press materials that signal large ambitions, collapsed when the company behind it went into administration. The gap between the announcement and the outcome was uncomfortable, and the timing of Edoardo's attendance at a design conference in Florida, while the Australian story was developing, attracted a degree of commentary. None of this derailed Bonda's core London operations, but it provided a reminder that the property development business is not insulated from failure by the elegance of its brochures, the engagement that ended, and the son it left behind. Before Princess Beatrice, there was Dara Huang. This is the part of Edoardo's story that the simpler versions of his biography tend to move past quickly, which is a mistake, because it is both humanly significant and structurally important to understanding everything that followed. Dara Huang is an American architect educated at Harvard, internationally recognized in her field, and by any account a woman of considerable achievement and presence. She and Edoardo became a couple, and then became engaged around 2014. They appeared to be building a life together. In 2016, that life produced a son. His name is Christopher Wolfe Mapelli Mozzi. The family calls him Wolfie. By 2018, the engagement was over. The specific reasons have never been aired publicly by either party, and that reticence is worth acknowledging as a form of dignity that is rarer than it should be in circles where public attention is constant. What is known is that they separated, that they have maintained a co-parenting arrangement that multiple sources have described as genuinely functional and civil, and that Wolfie remained a central figure in Edoardo's life without interruption. The timeline between the end of that engagement and the beginning of Edoardo's relationship with Beatrice is tight enough that it attracted notice and generated speculation, as these timelines always do. Neither party has addressed the speculation directly, which is entirely their right. What the timeline does make clear is that Edoardo moved from one serious, committed relationship into another without an extended period of public singledom in between, which tells you something about the kind of person he is. He is someone who builds toward permanence rather than circling it from a distance. When Beatrice entered the picture, Wolfie came with it. Princess Beatrice of York, granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth II, became a stepmother to a small boy whose existence was a living record of a relationship that had not worked out. By all available accounts, she embraced that role without apparent reservation. The co-parenting arrangement between Dara and Edoardo has allowed Wolfie to maintain relationships with both his parents and his stepmother, and the public record of this, occasional photographs, social media glimpses, the evident warmth of the adults involved, suggests a level of maturity in the management of a complicated family situation that is genuinely admirable. How a count finds a princess. The story of how Edoardo and Beatrice actually found each other is, at its core, a story about the social geography of a particular slice of British life in which certain families have known each other for so long that romance between their children is less a fairy tale than an eventual inevitability. The Mapelli Mozzi family and the York family, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, had been connected socially for years before their children became a couple. When the engagement was announced in September 2019, Edoardo's mother, Nikki Williams-Ellis, stated publicly that her family had known Beatrice for most of her life. This was not two strangers meeting at a party. This was two people from overlapping worlds who eventually looked at each other differently. Beatrice had ended a long-term relationship with property entrepreneur Dave Clark in 2016. Edoardo's engagement to Dara Huang ended in 2018. By the autumn of that year, the two had begun spending time together in ways that had moved beyond friendship, though the press did not confirm the relationship until November 2018. Their first public appearance, as a couple came in March 2019 at a fundraising event in London, and the confirmation that this was serious arrived 2 months later when they attended a royal wedding together. In September 2019, in Italy, Edoardo proposed. He had worked with British jeweler Sean Lean on a custom engagement ring, a detail that reflects the same attention to design that characterizes his professional work. Buckingham Palace announced the engagement on September 26, 2019, with a statement from the couple that was, by royal standards, straightforwardly warm and unadorned. They were happy. They were planning a life. That much was clear. The wedding that almost nobody witnessed. What was also clear, though not yet fully apparent to anyone watching, was that the wedding they were planning was about to become something entirely different from what either of them had intended. The original plan was a ceremony at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace in May 2020, followed by a reception in the gardens of Buckingham Palace. It would have been a significant occasion, the kind that generates commemorative coverage and large crowds outside the palace gates and photographs that circulate for years. Two things happened to prevent it, one connected to family and one connected to the world. In November 2019, just weeks after the engagement was announced, Beatrice's father, Prince Andrew, gave a television interview that became one of the most discussed and damaging media appearances in the royal family's recent history. His attempt to address his long association with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein produced an outcome so counterproductive that he was effectively withdrawn from public royal duties almost immediately afterward. The fallout settled heavily on his daughters. The elaborate wedding plans were quietly scaled back. A quieter ceremony began to feel not just preferable but necessary. Then the global pandemic arrived in the spring of 2020 and removed the remaining options. The Chapel Royal ceremony was postponed. The Buckingham Palace reception was cancelled. When Beatrice and Edoardo finally married on July 17, 2020, it was at the Royal Chapel of All Saints at Royal Lodge in Windsor, in a private ceremony attended only by close family, with no public announcement made in advance. The world learned it had happened after it was already over. What that stripped-down ceremony produced, almost accidentally, was something more genuinely moving than the grand occasion that had been planned. Beatrice wore a dress that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II, a silk taffeta gown originally created by Norman Hartnell in 1962 that the Queen had worn decades earlier. She also wore the Queen's own diamond fringe tiara, the same piece Her Majesty had worn on her own wedding day in 1947. In a ceremony from which nearly every planned element had been removed, Beatrice somehow wore the two most historically resonant objects in the entire family's possession. Prince Andrew walked his daughter down the aisle, but was not included in the official wedding photographs, a deliberate signal about where the focus of the day was meant to rest. The family they built and the shadows that followed. The life Beatrice and Edoardo constructed after that quiet wedding moved quickly and in multiple directions simultaneously. They settled initially in an apartment at St. James's Palace, before moving to a converted farmhouse in the Cotswolds, a substantial property with grounds, a swimming pool, and the kind of space that a blended family with young children and a business-driven need for occasional retreat from London genuinely requires. They maintain a London base during the working week for school and professional commitments, and use the countryside home as their primary family anchor at weekends. Beatrice is not a working royal in the formal institutional sense. She holds a senior position at a software company, working in strategic partnerships, and has maintained that professional life throughout her marriage. Edoardo runs Bonda. They are, more than most people who carry royal adjacency, people with actual working lives and the financial independence that comes from them. Their daughter Sienna Elizabeth was born in September 2021. She arrived into a family that already included Wolfie, and her position in the line of succession to the British throne, currently in the top 10 following the death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, meant that her birth was both a personal and a constitutional event. In late 2024, the couple announced a second pregnancy. Their daughter Athena Elizabeth Rose arrived prematurely in January 2025, several weeks before her due date, at the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. The experience was, by Beatrice's own account, frightening, and close. She subsequently took on a patronage role with a charity dedicated to addressing premature birth, describing the cause as deeply personal to her following Athena's early arrival. Through all of it, the shadow of the Epstein matter has not fully lifted. The release of documents by the United States Department of Justice in 2025 connected to the ongoing legal proceedings around Epstein and his associates included references that placed Beatrice's name in the vicinity of correspondence involving her parents. She was not accused of any wrongdoing. Being mentioned in a document is not an allegation. But in a media environment where the word Epstein and any royal family member's name in the same sentence generates immediate and sustained attention, the renewed scrutiny was real, and the discomfort of navigating it was visible. Edoardo's response to that scrutiny, as to most external pressures, was to continue. He attended industry events. He managed Banda's ongoing projects. He appeared at design conferences in Europe and the United States, representing his company with the same composed professionalism he has consistently projected regardless of what was happening in the background. The man behind the title. There is a version of the Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi story that would be easy to tell and not particularly illuminating. The count who married the princess. The property developer with the impressive portfolio. The man in the well-cut suit standing slightly to one side at official photographs. The more honest version is more interesting. He is a man who came from genuine privilege and chose to build something of his own rather than simply inherit a reputation. He is someone who loved a woman, had a child with her, watched that relationship end, and managed the aftermath with enough care and maturity that the child at the center of it has been able to grow up with both his parents present and functioning. He walked into a royal family in the middle of a crisis that had nothing to do with him, and has spent every year since demonstrating that steadiness is its own form of support. He is dyslexic, as is his wife, and both of them have spoken about that shared experience in ways that suggest it is genuinely connecting rather than merely a detail they hold in common. He lost a stepfather, Christopher Shale, in 2011, and responded to that loss by channeling grief into charitable action, helping fund and build Rwanda's first grass cricket stadium, and cycling through the night in London to raise money for the effort. These are not the gestures of a man performing his values.